Hello and welcome to the lecture on Indigenous responses to conquest. Before I actually go into the outline of the lecture, I just want to say a few things about the topic itself that we're covering for this week, because it's it's unusual in a few different ways. In the first place, looking at Indigenous people and in the Americas, in Spanish America, and how they were responding to conquest and how they participated in the building of an eventual colonial system, is a somewhat unusual topic to cover in a course on colonial Latin American history, and you might wonder why, since they were such a huge, they were the vast majority of the population, certainly in the 16th century and well into the 17th and the 18th centuries. And you know, this was their land. This was, where they come from. So why on earth would they be left out of this kind of history? But what you find in traditional histories of colonial Latin America is that there is quite a strong focus on the Spanish and Spanish actions. I should say, and Portuguese as well, sort of European actions, European sources, so Spanish and Portuguese sources, and the main actors in these histories, as Europeans, tend to be seen as sort of these kind of fully fleshed out characters, these sort of three-dimensional characters, whereas Indigenous people overall are largely left out of the story. And again, these are in sort of traditional narratives, the traditional approach to colonial Latin American history. And they're often seen as sort of the passive victims of conquest. They aren't differentiated from each other, apart from a few, prominent figures like, say, Montezuma or Atahualpa. You really don't learn much about individual indigenous actors. And even in the case of Montezuma and Atahualpa, what we get is, I think if you think back to what we learned about, the conquest, even in those cases, those characters, we really don't know that much about them, and they're presented in these, in certain lights, and in particular with Pizarro, Atahualpa is presented in a kind of light that makes Pizarro look good and justifies his actions, and then makes Atahualpa look bad. And actually, I would argue the same thing about Montezuma, that he's often portrayed as sort of, not knowing what to do, not knowing how to act, not knowing how to respond to Cortez, when in actual fact, these are, again, portrayals that are mainly presented by Spanish sources, by Spaniards or Spaniards interviewing Montezuma's enemies, decades later. So the whole point here is that you get quite a skewed vision of colonial Latin American history, if when you're looking at it from this traditional perspective. And in what we're doing this week is then, by focusing on Indigenous responses to conquest, we are now focusing a spotlight on Indigenous people, on their actions, on their participation in the colonizing process, and the ways that they put some limits on that, and then in some ways help to foster that process as well. And again, it's unusual because up until the 1960s or so, and we'll look into why this is the case, but up until the 1960s or so, Native Americans were basically left out of the historical record, with regard to the colonial history. So that makes this unusual, this sort of the week's lecture. And it also means that there is a particular purpose that I have in presenting this material, to try to correct that narrative and to try to counteract this, emphasis on Spaniards, on Europeans, Portuguese. And I will say also that also comes from the fact that the Spaniards were the sort of the victors, who are writing the history, but also tended to be the people who were more enfranchised in society and who were literate and would have left behind written records. And that this is true of history generally, that As you see, you've heard that phrase that history is written by the victors, but it's also written by the literate. The historical record that is left behind is left by those who can read and write, and those are usually in history, those people in society are the elites. Especially before you have widespread sort of public education, that's particularly the case, and is the case then here too. And even if we start to prioritize and include Native American writings and documents, even in those cases, they were often produced within the colonial regime itself, and they are far outweighed by the amount of Spanish sources available. But again, I'll talk about this a little bit more as we kind of get into the lecture. But at the same time, there are Native American sources that historians just didn't use for a long time. And then after the 60s, as I said, we'll start to see a change. This is also an unusual lecture in the sense that you often won't see a chapter like this in a textbook. So within the larger narrative of colonial history, there's sort of a set, you know, um, a set sequence of topics that you cover, and you won't see then this sort of pause between conquests that we looked at in the last few weeks, and then what we're going to look at after the midterm, which is sort of a major transition period into a full-fledged colony. You usually don't have this sort of week in between them, or this unit in between them, to sort of get a sense of, okay, so we see what the Spaniards have done. We've seen the cruelties that they have practiced. We've seen the encomienda system and the disaster that it was, and now we've seen, the spiritual conquest and those efforts and the successes and failures of it. Again, all sort of portrayed by and carried out by Spaniards. Now, how is it that Indigenous people are responding to this? How are they working to, mitigate the effects of colonialism, or how are they continuing to ally with Europeans in terms of economic priorities and things like that? Like, what's happening on the ground that you're not going to tend to see something like this in a textbook. And one final point I just want to make is that there's a sort of a political aspect to this topic as well, not in the sense of politics like, modern political parties in the United States, Republican, Democrat, things like that, but political in the sense of power and where you see power lying in society, who has power, who doesn't, how is that power played out, how's that power sort of carried out and implemented within a society. These are issues that I'm interested in here and that we're going to explore in this lecture as well. And what I mean by that is that by bringing out certain historical voices, and especially those voices that have been silenced over decades, centuries, generations, you in this way, I'm making a statement here about the fact that I believe that Native American voices, Native American actions, Native American sources are extremely important to bring into the historical record. And we'll also see a more recent movement in colonial Latin American history, and that is written by historians, to also bring in African voices. There's a significant African population throughout colonial Latin America as a result of the Atlantic slave trade, people who were brought against their will to labor on behalf of Europeans, and they have also been left out of the historical record. So the idea here is that we're going to bring in these voices for this week, Indigenous voices, and then we will see African voices also after after the midterm. But in this sense, then there's sort of a political aspect to this, as I said, in terms of power dynamics, power relations, and as a historian myself, I'm making a statement to you about the fact that I see all people in a society as having some semblance of power, even in an exploitative system, as we'll talk about in the lecture, but also that I believe it is crucial to bring in these voices as well. So traditional historians say prior to the 1960s, a historian might have said, well, why would we care about these Native American voices? Why would we care about the common people? Why would we care about the poor, disenfranchised, illiterate laborers in this society? What we want to pay attention to are the movers and shakers, the leaders, the governors, the kings, the major, the bishops, the archbishops. What is the Pope saying? So, you know, what the elites are doing, how the elites are acting, and what kind of society they are creating. That's what, prior to the 60s, that historians were focusing in on more. And again, by, bringing this subject into our class and focusing in on it this week, I'm also saying that I think it's important to bring, to again, shed light on people who have typically been disenfranchised in society, but also show their ability to act on their own behalf, their ability to negotiate power relations, and most importantly, to bring in their voices as much as possible and their actions, so that we have a focus on all people in society as much as possible, not just the elites, but common people as well, regular people. And finally, this is also a political topic because we're going to look at some theories about society, sort of social theories that come out of a Marxist left-wing tradition. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But for all of these reasons, there's sort of a backstory and a need for some explanation here about this. The focus for this week. So that's kind of a long introduction and prelude to what we're going to be examining. And I think you'll see these themes as they play out over the course of the lecture. And so to turn to the outline that I have here now, again, we're going to be looking at Indigenous responses to conquest and their participation in the establishment of this sort of early fledgling colonial society. And we're going to start by looking at something called historiography, which if you haven't been exposed to that term before, if this is a new term for you, I'll explain it in just a second what it is. And then we're going to look into some definitions of some key terms that are related to the social theories that we're going to be looking at. And then we're going to look at a series of different kinds of responses to conquest and how they show these different kind of power relations and how they show this social theory kind of playing out. So first I'm going to talk about historiography, like I said, and for the IDs, then the definitions of the terms we're going to look at are syncretism, agency, and hegemony. We'll be talking about those. I know that that can look like hegemony, but it's pronounced hegemony. And then we're also going to look at the Virgin of Guadalupe, who is the patron saint of Mexico, and the ways that she represents some of the responses that we're going to be looking at. And also this will be related, as it always is, to the readings that we're going to have for this week as well. So let me start then by talking about historiography. Oh, so I should say this is a political topic, as I just went into. I always get ahead of myself before the slide. But so this is a political topic. Why? And I've talked about that to some extent. And so what I wanted to then say is or what I had said a minute ago, is that the ideas we're going to talk about today are related to social theory that comes out of a Marxist tradition. And in particular, we're going to be talking about a concept of cultural hegemony that was developed by a social theorist from the early 20th century named Antonio Gramsci. He was an Italian theorist, and he was a follower of Karl Marx, but he disagreed, or I shouldn't say he disagreed, but he saw some flaws in Marx's arguments, or at least he saw some things that needed to be added to it. And he was actually imprisoned by the Italian Fascist Party in the 1920s and into the 30s. And this was while he was in prison. He actually wrote up his theories, and they are published in a a publication called the Prison Notebooks by Antonio Gramsci. And his theories of hegemony, which I'll talk about in the lecture, are really useful for understanding how power works in societies and how and why people accept their place in society, and for understanding oppressive systems and how oppressive systems are instituted within a society and also perpetuated through that society, not necessarily through the use of force, but by cultural means. So if you've ever studied Marxism, what Marx argued was that, among a number of things, what Marx argued was that the way that history moves over time, and what brings change in history and makes history dynamic, is class struggle. That there are people who, there are sort of the haves and the have-nots, the people who own factories, the people who are very wealthy, and are the owners of, say, industrial production. And then there are the people who work in factories, and then who work in the places that are owned, by the what Marx called the bourgeoisie. So there's the proletarians who work in the factories, and then there's the bourgeoisie who owns the factories, and they are constantly in a struggle over over resources. They are in a constant struggle for wealth, where the owner wants to pay the worker as little as possible, and wants the worker to produce as much as possible in order to make the owner as rich as possible. Whereas the workers who work in the factories, at the same time, they want some basic minimum wages. They want some basic benefits so that they can live a decent existence and be able to provide for their children. And so what Marx argued was that there's this constant sort of struggle between these classes, and that's sort of natural and inherent in society, and that things like ideas don't really matter, that things like culture aren't the things that move history, that and instead it's this basic struggle for material gain, that is the basis of history and the basis for the causes of change in history. And Gramsci actually argued that no, that's a bit too focused on the material. Ideas do matter. Culture does matter, and the way that people sort of understand their existence and their place within it matters. It's not just this struggle for wealth and resources, but it's also a struggle of ideas, that ideas do have influence in society. So again, I'll pick this up in a little while. I'll talk more about what his theory was, but what I just wanted to sort of put forth here is that he certainly was. Gramsci certainly was a Marxist, again, sort of adding some layers to Marx's arguments. But this comes out of, a left-wing political ideologies. And I just want to say this for full disclosure so that you know where this is coming from as well. I'm not presenting this because, I want to, teach you about Marxism, but more because, or even present a sort of a left-wing ideology here, but more because Gramsci's theories of cultural hegemony are really, really useful for explaining and understanding what happens in Mexico and Peru in the 16th century under Spanish rule, and how Spanish colonization does end up gaining sort of a foothold in among indigenous people and in indigenous cultures, but again, not because they were just passively accepting Spanish rule, but because there were certain things within it that they were able to in some ways take advantage of, but they also resisted as well. So anyway, that's Gramsci. Now I want to turn to historiography. So in order to understand sort of and look at indigenous responses and the significance of it, we need to look at historiography, and particularly the historiography of colonial Latin America. So I'm going to talk more generally what historiography is, and then look at it specifically with regard to the field of colonial Latin American history. So in the first place, then, for those, particularly for those of you who haven't been exposed to this term before, and if you aren't a history major, and even if you are, it's likely you've never seen this term before and you're thinking, what is this? So historiography is something that professional historians deal with a lot. This is a really, really important. Once you get into graduate work in history and once you become a professional historian, you deal with historiography a lot. So, what is it? Basically, basically, historiography is the the history of history. It's the history of historical writing, the history of historical interpretations, and the ways that historical interpretations change over time. And they may change based on sort of the context of the time and what people are interested in a particular society, what's really important to that society at that time. Oftentimes then historians will examine those issues in history, or how the origins and development, say, of a certain idea or theme within history. It You would look at within this too, then how historical interpretations change over time as well. And this can be based not only on how the context changes, but sometimes the availability of documents. So what kinds of documents a historian uses, what kinds of sources a historian uses, will also influence what that historian's interpretations might be. So for instance, say, what you'll often see in history is that, again, prior to the 1960s, there's not much focus on what women were doing in history. Or at that time, historians may have said, you know, could have easily thought that, what if women are largely confined to the domestic sphere, historically, well, that, again, that's not really important. We don't need to know what the household was like or how domestic duties, played out. And so in that way, then, women are sort of, not included in the historical record, and there wasn't much focus on women. After the 1960s, you start to see a lot more focus on women. And again, I think you're probably going to get the sense here too that we're going to see that with Indigenous people too, with Native Americans, that prior to the 60s, not much attention paid. These aren't important historical actors. Why would we look at this? These aren't important historical topics. Why would we examine this? And then you're going to use sources that also are going to not point you in the direction of looking at, say, the domestic sphere or looking at what Indigenous people are doing, and instead maybe you're going to focus on the royal correspondence of kings, the meeting minutes of the Council of the Indies, what the viceroy is, the kinds of reports that the viceroy is sending back to the crown. You're not going to be looking at the kinds of documents that would get you into what common people are doing or what women are doing. But if you start to look at different kinds of sources, maybe you're going to look at cabildo sources, so town council meeting minutes, then you're going to start to see a lot more in terms of local issues. You might see, especially among an Indigenous town council, this is where you're going to start to see Indigenous actors and what Indigenous people are interested in. So depending on what kinds of sources you look at will also color the kinds of interpretations that a historian might make. And also what you want to find out from the sources. For instance, there might be women or Indigenous people all through even the traditional sources that you're looking at. But if you're not looking for them, if that's not what you're interested in, or you kind of put blinders on as you're reading through those documents, then again, you're going to come up with a certain kind of interpretation. And how those interpretations change over time, again, based on historical context, based on the kinds of sources people are using, based on the things they're interested in looking for, that will affect the kinds of interpretations that historians make as well. How and why did the conquest take place? Or moving into, say, the 20th century, how and why did the civil rights movement take place? And there, or how and why did the Civil War take place? What are the causes of the Civil War? There are huge debates among historians that will, that move over decades. And these interpretations can change pretty dramatically over time. And so this is basically historiography. It's the It's the history of history writing and the history of how historical debates and interpretations have changed over time. And in that way, it's really a history of of the historians, what the historians are writing. So if you're going to do a historiography of colonial Latin America, you're not going to so much look at the actual history of the events, but you're going to look at the debates among historians about how and why these events took place and how and why you got the outcome that you did. So it's basically the history of historical writing and historical interpretation. And we are going to look at then the historiography of colonial Latin America and how it has changed over time and why it has changed over time. And so I'm going to spend the next sort of several minutes talking about this. In the first place, I've already referred to this a number of times. There's sort of a traditional view of colonial Latin American history, or a traditional narrative for it. And by narrative, I mean the sort of the story that is told, sort of the big picture of what are the main events and basic reasoning as to how and why these events took place. So in the traditional narrative of colonial Latin American history, it tended to be written from a Spanish perspective. And depicted from a Spanish perspective, as I've already sort of referred to. And it tended to, actually, I'll get to the displacement model in just a second. So it tended to be from a Spanish perspective, where Spaniards are the main actors, and they're mainly using Spanish sources, Spanish language sources produced by Spaniards for Spaniards. For the information. And in that way, that's going to color the kinds of interpretations that took place from that. So in terms of the Spanish sources, some examples might be, as we've even seen in this class, Columbus's letters and diaries, Cortez's letters, the works of Bernal Diaz, the writings of Pizarro's secretaries depicting the conquest. These would be the traditional sources that historians would use, or as I was talking about too, the reports of viceroys that were sent to the Spanish crown. So documents that are written by Spaniards in Spanish for other Spaniards. And by the same token, then, Indigenous people are often portrayed, as you can imagine, as passive. As I said, they are not singled out as major actors, or if they are, they're sort of foils for that to make Cortez and Pizarro look good. They are often not fully fleshed out characters. They are portrayed as sort of the passive masses, the sort of passive victims of conquest, and not seen as individual actors themselves in the same way that the Spaniards are. And what this does is this Spanish perspective and this emphasis on Spanish documents and actors, what this does is it leads to a certain kind of interpretation of colonial Latin American history, and in particular, a displacement model of conquest. So what was the displacement model? Another way to characterize the displacement model, or label it, might be what I could also call the total destruction model, which is the idea that in the conquest, or immediately after conquest, the Spaniards are in control, in charge. There is an immediate colonization that takes place. There is an immediate and total destruction of indigenous culture, indigenous ideas. Native American society is destroyed, and it happens in an absolute kind of monolithic way, and it's immediate. So 1521, Tenochtitlan falls. Cortez becomes the governor of Mexico, and now Spanish colonization is in place there. And indigenous people are immediately brought into under Spanish rule and are going along with Spanish, are basically submitting to Spanish rule. In this way, indigenous people then are portrayed, as I said, as the sort of the passive vessels for Spanish domination. So again, it's this idea that colonization takes place immediately, that it's definitive, it's monolithic and absolute. It happens, right away, and it signifies the destruction of indigenous culture. And you'll often see, and I I still sometimes see in midterms and final exams, which is I wish I didn't, but you'll still sometimes see these references to, Aztec society was wiped out, Inca society was destroyed. And so this is that displacement model. And as we'll see, this is not true. I think you can argue that Pizarro and Cortez conquered Cuzco and Tenochtitlan, respectively. I think you could argue that Tenochtitlan was effectively destroyed. But did that destroy Aztec culture and Nahua culture more generally? Absolutely not. And once you go outside of these major capital cities, you see a continuation of indigenous life ways, continuing in some ways virtually uninterrupted, among indigenous people. So rural village life, out if you live out in an IU, your life really may not have changed all that much. So anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but basically that traditional narrative then is based on a Spanish perspective, and it leads to an interpretation of what I refer to as a displacement model of sort of a total and immediate Spanish conquest. And you can see an example of this by a famous historian, William Prescott, who wrote in the 19th century, he wrote sort of a famous classic history of it's entitled The History of the Conquest of Mexico and Peru. And I'll just read you a quote from the preface of the book where you can see some of this displacement model and this kind of interpretation in place. And I will say he used only Spanish sources when he did his research. His work was actually innovative just in the fact that he was using, primary sources, but and sources from the time of conquest, and actually basing it on these sources. But at the same time, it's very much within that displacement model. So what he says is, among the remarkable achievements of the Spaniards in the 16th century, there is no one more striking to the imagination than the conquest of Mexico. So here he's just referring to Mexico in this part of the book. The subversion of a great empire by a handful of adventurers, taken with all its strange and picturesque accompaniments, has the air of romance rather than of sober history. So he's romanticizing it. He is emphasizing here the Spanish role in this. He's saying that also that it took place by, that conquest was achieved by a handful of adventurers, so giving all the credit to Cortez and his followers rather than the Tlaxcalan allies, and then the importance of the smallpox epidemic that really facilitated and made possible the defeat of Tenochtitlan. That is all just swept under the rug, and the focus then is on these Spaniards, these adventurers who miraculously and romantically are able to, defeat this empire, immediately and definitively. So there you can see that displacement model in place, and this same kind of displacement model interpretation also is often invoked with regard to the spiritual conquest as well. Just that terminology itself of the spiritual conquest implies that these friars came in, they were able to, within just a few decades, baptize and convert all these, millions of Native Americans. And as we talked about last week, and we will also revisit this week as well, yes, there is a lot of, baptism going on, but is it a true conversion? Are these people being truly converted? And it neglects the all of the problems that arose and some of the failures of the spiritual conquest, and it neglects to address the idea that maybe the kind of religion that Native Americans begin to practice is certainly influenced by Catholicism, and might be even considered Catholicism, but it's going to be very different from Roman Catholicism. So Catholicism in Latin America develops in its own unique way, and as we'll see in this lecture today too, largely because it becomes a product of Native American traditions and Catholic traditions. It becomes a blending of these traditions. So you can see then the displacement model applied to conquest and to the quote unquote spiritual conquest as well. So these are kind of traditional. This is sort of the traditional narrative, but that begins to change, as I've referred to several times now. Around the 1960s, we start to see a change in the traditional narrative and a number of challenges to it that then results in some new interpretations of conquest and colonization that we're going to look at as well. And so what happens is in the 1960s, you start to see what we call a revisionist history. So people are coming in and trying to revise the traditional narrative. So this revisionist history, as I've said, begins in the 60s. And why is this the case? Well, if you think back to what was happening in the US in the 1960s, we've got the civil rights movement, we've got the women's rights movement, we've got the Chicano movement, and all of those were going on to try to kind of raise awareness about the kinds of injustices that were going on in society, and this filters into historical writing as well. And along with that, you also have sort of what's referred to as the democratization of U.S. universities, in which universities were made more accessible to a wider cross section of the population. And in that way, they went from educating, say, only sort of a largely white upper class elite and largely a white upper class male elite to educating a much wider and more diverse cross section of the population, not only in terms of class, but also in terms of ethnicity and having sort of greater diversity as well. And this happens because of a number of things. In the first place, you start to have student loan programs where students can then borrow money in order to be able to go to school. And I know that this can have very problematic implications as well, in terms of the huge amount of student debt that is out there right now, and also sort of predatory lending, practices, especially by the for-profit universities. But with regard to the availability of these loans, and particularly government, not private loans, but government loans at low interest, did allow people to be able to borrow money in order to be able to go to school. And I can say for myself, that's how I was able to fund the first few years of my graduate work. Was I took out student loans and did pay them back for many years. I'm a product of that as well. There is no way I could have gone to graduate school and completed a PhD without those loans available. And in that way, I'm really glad that I did it. It allowed me to be able to complete my education and also to be able to get a job that I love. Um, so anyway, so despite some of the problems and issues that have come up with student loans, and I think it would be better if universities could be free. If that's not going to be the case, these loans did allow people who didn't come from wealthy backgrounds to be able to go to school, to be able to borrow money at low interest and go to school. You also have the GI Bill, in which veterans were and are able to get funding for further education. And again, my dad had the GI Bill. He went to school with the GI Bill, and we have a number of students in our graduate program who have used the GI Bill too. So I have seen personally just how incredibly helpful and useful that was. But anyway, because of the GI Bill, then you have a number of then veterans who are also able to go to school to complete a higher education. And all of this then helps to not only make university education accessible to more people, but in that way also kind of democratizes it and opens it up to non-elites as well. And I'll just read you a quote from the chancellor of UC Berkeley, several years ago, he was talking about the GI Bill, and he said the GI Bill democratized universities by providing access to vast numbers of young men and now women who would never otherwise have received an education. Equally important, it opened the doors of elite private universities to a much broader spectrum of the population. It produced an educated workforce that revitalized the American economy. Universities expanded in size and importance. So you can see the great importance of this sort of democratization process on society generally that the Berkeley chancellor was talking about. But with regard to history, it has an enormous impact on how history is written and challenging. People started, newly trained historians start challenging traditional narratives. Because the effects of this democratization of the universities and the sort of the expansion of the university system leads to changes in the historical profession. Because what happens is that graduate schools in history then begin to accept a much wider variety of students into their program. So students of color, children of immigrants, women begin to enter graduate programs in history. And in this way, it leads to changes in the way that history was written because these students were interested in investigating new kinds of topics, particularly wanting to get to voices that had not been traditionally heard and brought into the historical narrative, as I talked about a few minutes ago with regard to Indigenous people in the Americas. They also started using new kinds of sources rather than that traditional kind of diplomatic correspondence, or this, correspondence among, the elite leaders of society. Now they turn away from that and they start doing what is often referred to as sort of social history, looking at the history of societies and the common people, what's also referred to as history from below. They start using things like wills, diaries, and not just diaries of famous people like Columbus, but diaries of say midwives living in the colonial U.S., or the diaries of just everyday people, correspondence between everyday people, looking at meeting minutes of towns in North Carolina in the 1850s and 60s, looking and also sort of broadening out the kinds of sources that were used as well, looking into music history, posters, memoirs, artifacts, and all sorts of what would have been considered kind of unorthodox kinds of sources. They start to look into that. They start asking new questions of the sources, looking for, say, their ancestors in these sources, looking for the actions of women in the domestic sphere in these sources. And in this way, it leads to new kinds of conclusions where they start to challenge what historians would refer to as sort of the grand narratives of history. For instance, the founding fathers and the idea that you can raise yourself up from your bootstraps in the United States. When you start to look into, say, the history of slavery, the history of tenement houses, and the terrible labor conditions that, say, immigrants were subjected to in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, this is going to challenge this idea of the United States as sort of the land of the free, where everybody has equal opportunity. You're going to see that no, I mean, slaves, immigrants, they didn't have these same kinds of opportunities, or this might be a story for some, but not for all. And so they start to challenge these traditional assumptions and these kind of grand narratives that dominated, say, national histories. And I want to read you a quote about this whole process from a book called Telling the Truth About History, which sort of explores the history of the U.S. historical profession. And in that, they sort of tell this story about the revisionist history and how it comes out of the 1960s. And so I'll just read you a quote from this. They said, as they wrote, the authors wrote, suddenly graduate students with strange, unpronounceable surnames with Brooklyn accents and different skin colors appeared in the venerable ivy-colored buildings that epitomized elite schooling. Their parents didn't own stock. Many did not own their own houses. These young researchers looked for their ancestors in the American past, but they found them in the most unlikely places for historical personages: shop floors, slave quarters, drawing rooms, relocation centers, rice fields, and tent revivals. They began poring over long ignored records of births, marriages, deaths, probate inventories, land titles, slave purchases, city plans, and tax assessments. They also illuminated the lives of those men and women who had been cast into the shadows by the conventional spotlight thrown on pathbreakers and heroes. So here you can, in that quote, you can see the sort of the story I've been telling. It's kind of an encapsulation of this story, of this revisionist history, and how and why it comes about. So let's turn then to what happens in colonial Latin American history, and the historiography and how it changes with this revisionist history. For colonial Latin American history, as I've already alluded to, um, it changes in the 60s too. The historians trained in graduate schools in the 1960s start to explore new topics. And in particular, they start to become interested in Native American history, and how Native Americans fared during and after the quote unquote conquest, what role they played in the building of the colonial system, how did their lives change or not after conquest. And to do that, they started to look at new kinds of sources. So instead of just focusing on the Spanish sources, they start to bring in indigenous sources as well. For instance, they start to look at, say, Aztec writings, the codices, the pictographic writing that was happening, prior to the Spanish arrival in the Aztec Empire. It's happening before and after. As I think I had talked about previously, a lot of these sources had been destroyed, had been, say, burned by previous leaders or by the Spaniards once they arrived, but there are some surviving pre-conquest codices, and then a number that are produced by indigenous people after the arrival of the Spanish as well, including or I should say, there are codices written. There are also land titles. There are court documents that are produced. There was a quote unquote Indian court that was established under in the Spanish colonies in the viceroyalties, and these documents were produced in native languages. In Mexico, you have a number of Nahuatl documents, of court records of indigenous court records, and the same happens in Peru, that are written in Quechua and other native languages. And as we'll see, historians start to learn these languages so that they can access these sources. There's also the Florentine Codex, which was produced by Bernardino de Sahagún, which we talked about a bit last week at his school in Santiago Tlatelolco, where he would train in, the sons of native leaders in order to be able to read and write in Latin. But he also engineered or organized a whole ethnographic study where he had Nahuas interviewing Nahuas about Aztec history, Aztec culture, and I should say broader Nahua culture and life as well. So historians start to use these sources to understand the colonial history. So they start using not just Spanish sources, but indigenous sources as well. And from this, then, oh, sorry, I'll get to that in a second, they come up with a whole series of new conclusions about colonial history that really start to question and eventually upset that whole idea of the displacement model. They start to problematize that displacement model, they challenge it, and they come up with a whole series of new conclusions about colonial history and how it unfolded. So I just want to show you here, this is an example of a collection of indigenous sources. This was written by a pioneer in Mexican history, Miguel Leon Portillo. And what he did was, he was, as I said, a Mexican scholar, and in the 60s and 70s, he starts to go back to these indigenous documents. And as I said, many of them were written in Nahuatl, or had never been, were still in handwritten manuscript form, and he transcribes them and then translates them into Spanish, and then publishes those sources in a volume he called The Broken Spears. And then here, this is what I'm showing you here is actually an English translation of his work in Spanish. And so this is actually a really pioneering work in the field that allowed historians and students of colonial Latin American history to have access to these indigenous documents through the work that he was doing. And then, as I said, historians do start to learn the native languages as well. So they're using new topic, they're addressing new topics, they're looking into new sources to understand these topics, and they're asking then new questions of these sources as well. Again, not just what are the Spanish doing, but what are indigenous people doing, how are they responding to conquest as well. So now you're probably starting to see then how is this relevant to what we're talking about today. This is exactly where this comes from. The focus on indigenous responses comes out of this revisionist history and historiography. And as I said then, because of all of this work, they come up with new conclusions. And so instead of a displacement model or this assumption that once Cortez and Pizarro come in and conquer Tenochtitlan and Cusco, that now we've got a Spanish colonial society in place and these indigenous societies are destroyed. Instead, what historians said was, oh, hold on, I'll get to this in a second, is that colonization happens in phases, and it takes a long time for it to take place and come into effect. So I'll talk more about that in just a second, but I want to show you then some of the major works in the historiography of colonial Latin America that really focus in on Native Americans and indigenous history and indigenous actions. And I'll just go through these sort of quickly, but it moves over time. This goes from the 60s into the 90s. This was a real focus for historians for several decades, of this idea of we really want to go in and recover the indigenous past. And I'll go sort of from left to right and then top to bottom through these different works. These are some of the major classics in the field that if you go to graduate school in colonial Latin American history, you will need to read and know these works, and be able to be conversant in them and what these authors' main contributions were, what their arguments were, what kind of source material they use. This is what professional historians do. And whenever you do your own research, you have to then know the historiography of your field, know what the major arguments have been over time and interpretations, and then where does yours fit in? How are, whose interpretations are you challenging? Whose work are you building on? And what are your conclusions? What's original about the research that you're doing? And any of our graduate students in our master's program who do a master's thesis have to make those same arguments within their master's thesis as well. So anyway, to begin then, that on the far left is Charles Gibson's work, The Aztecs Under Spanish Rule. That was written in the early 60s. And what Gibson did was, he's sort of the first major historian of colonial Latin America and the United States to say, you know what, I really, we know what the Spaniards were doing. I want to know how the Aztecs fared following the fall of Tenochtitlan. What was their life like? How did their society develop, continue and develop? What were the social structures, the economic structures in which they lived? What were they? And how were they influenced and impacted by conquest? And so he specifically wants to look at then indigenous people, at the Aztecs themselves, and how their society then again was impacted by Spanish rule. He continues to look at sort of traditional Spanish sources, but he's looking for indigenous actions within those sources. Then we move on to Steve Stern's book called Peru's Indian Peoples and the Challenge of Spanish Conquest. That was produced in the 70s. And he works in a largely a Marxist framework, and sort of Marxist interpretations. But in this work, he argues, he really looks for indigenous actors in a particular region of Peru, and again shows the ways that indigenous people were reacting to Spanish rule, and in some ways how the leaders were actually sort of in some ways negotiating with and cooperating with Spanish authorities as well. And then the next book by Karen Spalding, Waro Chiri, has a similar approach. She's looking at a particular region in Peru, and again looking at how Andean peoples then again were sort of responding to and sort of living within Spanish rule. So again, all these three works kind of focusing in on indigenous people, and for the most part still looking into largely Spanish sources for this work. Then the next work we have is William Taylor, Drinking, Homicide, and Rebellion in Colonial Mexican Villages. And Taylor was actually a student of Charles Gibson, and he wrote this book in the 70s. And again, this is sort of what we would call a social history, looking at history from below and looking at social practices among common people, and in this case, among common indigenous people in indigenous villages. And in particular, he largely used court cases to get at this. Again, largely Spanish language sources, but again, looking at indigenous actors within these sources, looking at drinking practices, looking at homicide cases, and then also cases of rebellion. So this is a social history, which is then geared toward looking at indigenous actors. Then we get into the 80s with Nancy Ferris's Maya Society Under Colonial Rule, and what she looks at is how were Mayan peoples responding to Spanish rule, and in particular, she argues that in some ways they were able to sort of negotiate their position within this rule, but when they couldn't, they would just sort of leave. They had this what she refers to as sort of an escape hatch. They could sort of just leave settlements and go into sort of the highland jungles, and sort of disappear from kind of move out of the areas of Spanish jurisdiction. So again, looking at how they are responding to and faring under Spanish colonial rule. And then moving further into the 80s and then into the 90s, you have The Conquest of Mexico by Serge Grzinski. And what he actually looks into is he starts to bring in sort of cultural influences, and looks at how Nahuas in particular adopted certain aspects of Spanish writing. If you remember, we had Spanish friars who were writing down grammars, and in that sense preserving indigenous languages in that way, so that later people could learn and study them and be able to read them. And what he argues in this book is that, or what he looks at, is that the ways that Nahua peoples, how their thinking and writing changed gradually as their writing becomes alphabetized, as Nahuatl is sort of brought into the Latin alphabet in different, letters assigned to, say, symbols and signs within Nahuatl, or sounds within Nahuatl, as Nahuatl basically gets written down in a Latinized alphabet, how that affects Nahua thinking as well. And one example of this is that in the ways that Nahua peoples wrote down their own histories, you see a transition from a more cyclical idea of history. If you think back to the Aztec calendar stone and Aztec ideas about a sort of a cyclical history, even that goes back to kind of Olmec concepts of the different kinds of calendars, and when the calendars coincide, that this can, signify certain auspicious dates, which lends itself to kind of a cyclical concept of history. He looks at the transition from the cyclical concept to a more linear concept of history, that is more characteristic of Western and sort of European society, European historical writing. And then finally, we have James Lockhart's The Nawas after the conquest. This was written in the 90s, and James Lockhart was a professor at UCLA for a long, long time, and he trained actually generations of scholars to be able to read Nahuatl. So what Lockhart did was he said, okay, this is great. I'm glad that, that we're all, revising this problematic traditional narrative, but we need to learn, if we're really going to bring in native voices, we have to learn native languages. Nahuatl, Quechua, Mayan, and for Mexico, Mixtec is another sort of major language that was spoken by the Mixtec people in the Oaxaca region. And then you have in the region of Michoacan a language that's often referred to as Tarascan, but a more accurate term is Purepecha. And so people in UCLA, graduate students in UCLA, started to get training in all these different indigenous languages, and then they're able to have then access to these native language documents as well, particularly in the Indian courts that were set up throughout colonial Latin America. And so you've got scholars who are then who have been trained in all these different languages, who then go and train their own graduate students, and this has really been pioneered by people at UCLA and is still going on today. One of Lockhart's students, Kevin Terraciano, is now a professor at UCLA, and he works in Mixtec languages. I'm sorry, in the Mixtec language, and he has also trained graduate students. And a number of years ago, I actually we had a graduate student in Latin American Studies here at SDSU, whose family came from Michoacan, and he learned Purepecha, and he went on to UCLA. He got a full ride scholarship and did his PhD at UCLA under working with Kevin Terraciano. So you can see how these networks aren't just sort of these abstract things, but are actually really happening and are still happening today. The historiography of colonial Latin America is still developing, and also just so you can see sort of how these networks happen as well. So Charles Gibson trained William Taylor. So he was William Taylor's advisor at the University of Michigan, and then William Taylor went on to teach at Berkeley, and then I actually worked with William Taylor when I did my PhD at Berkeley, and he was one of my professors and was on my dissertation committee. So I had worked with him as well. So you can see again this is a relatively small world, and these things are ongoing, and you can see the influence of these scholars on each other, on subsequent scholars, on their students, and then how their students then have influence on their own students once they become professors. So this is just sort of a survey of some of the main classic works in colonial Latin America in terms of the revisionist history, and then the focus on indigenous people. And as I said, this continues on, but these guys really sort of set the stage for what scholars started to do moving into the 21st century. And I'll just say there's also been a focus more recently on bringing in the African heritage, the Afro-Latin American heritage of colonial Latin American history. For a long time, as we see through the 60s and 70s, and then into the 90s, really, there is a major focus among colonial Latin Americanists on bringing Native Americans into the history and the historical narrative. And then in the 21st century, sort of the last sort of 20 years or so of Latin American historiography has, in the colonial period, has focused also on bringing in African voices as well, because that was left out. Even as in the 60s and 70s, as these scholars are working on bringing in the Native American voice, the African voice has largely been left out, and that has been a more recent trend. And just to go through that. I was going to say that historiography very quickly. You have Colin Palmer's Slaves of the White God, where he looks at the slave trade in Mexico in the sort of later 16th and then through the 17th century. Um, that was sort of the pioneering work in the field that really brings to light. Oftentimes, sort of the slave trade and the existence of slavery in Mexico and Peru was often ignored, and so in that way, Palmer's work was pioneering. But in many ways, it's quite a traditional kind of economic history. Um, and then what you start to see moving into the 90s and then the 2000s, you see Herman Bennett looking into colonial blackness, where he's really looking into identities and how Afro Latin American identities formed in Mexico. So this is more of what we would call a cultural approach rather than an economic. Look at how many slaves were brought, what was the impact on the economy. Then Bennett really starts to look into identity issues. Then the next book, again going sort of left to right, top to bottom, is a book. It's not as clear here. It's sort of a bit fuzzy, but it's called Christians, Blasphemers, and Witches, written by a historian named Joan Bristol, where she's looking at African identities in colonial Mexico, and particularly looking at African healers and the continuation of African healing traditions and religious practices as well. Then you see the next book I want to talk about is Matthew Restall's The Black Middle. Again, something from the 2000s, where he looks here at people of African descent who are brought to or who arrive in Yucatan, often as sort of either slaves or servants of Spaniards, but who play a absolutely vital role in Yucatan society in terms of being sort of intermediaries between Spaniards and the Maya. And Restall has actually published an enormous amount. He's been a very, very productive scholar and really looking at Indigenous and African, their role in the conquest and the crucial role that they played. And this has been something that's really been that he has really worked to contribute to the historiography. He also was trained at UCLA and is part of that sort of that learning, indigenous languages and bringing in particularly Mayan voices. That's what he's done a lot of. But you can see then he also has really worked to bring in the African heritage and the African voices as well. Then the next work you have is Ben Vinson, a book called Bearing Arms for His Majesty, where he looked at, and we'll look at this in a few weeks, at militias that form in the 18th century throughout colonial Latin America, throughout colonial Spanish America, as a way to try to defend the colonies from possible foreign invaders. And he looks at militia that was composed of men of color, and particularly of men of African descent, in the 18th century. That's what he's kind of looking at. And then just to the right of that, you can see this is Ben Vincent, that he was giving a lecture at Harvard about this, about basically bringing in Afro-Latin American voices and experiences into colonial Latin American history. And so you can see that this is something that's been really important to historians, again, to bring in a more full and more accurate depiction of colonial Latin American history. And then finally, I'll just show you, I'll just talk about this final book, In the Shadow of Slavery. This is written by Judith Carney, she's a geographer at UCLA, and she's done some really, really interesting work on African material culture in the Americas. She wrote an earlier book about rice, rice cultivation in South Carolina, and how it's largely the history of rice cultivation largely comes from its African species of rice, or adaptations, African variations of different kinds of rice variations that were cultivated in South Carolina, and then also African and particularly African women's rice cultivation techniques. And so she brings those same ideas to, but sort of on a larger scale in this book, In the Shadow of Slavery, where she looks at how Africans, and particularly African women, again, bring different African species, largely mainly staple crops, and then also fruits and vegetables, and how they are cultivated. And then in this case, throughout the Americas, she looks at sort of Brazil, she looks at Mexico, she looks at the Caribbean, and then also the U.S. Southeast, sort of the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, is a really wide-ranging, interesting work, and really interesting use of a whole variety of sources. So hopefully this gives you a sense then of how the historiography of the field has developed from the 60s into the present. And I just want to add one final note here, which is some of the most recent work then, with regard to Native Americans in colonial Latin American history, has been a focus on the participation of Indigenous people in conquest. I should say Indigenous people and Africans in the conquest history. You can see there's a relatively recent book called Indian Conquistadors, looking at, again, the role of Native allies, but and who, allying with, say, Cortez and Pizarro, but considering themselves, conquistadors in and of themselves. And what these authors argue is that really what has traditionally been seen as sort of a European conquest or a Spanish conquest was really perceived by indigenous people as conquest among themselves. And the Spaniards, the Europeans really are not a big part of this story, if at all. And then you see that in that central text, the one in the middle by it's an edited volume by Susan Kellogg, and again you see Matthew Restall there, where they're really trying to bring in indigenous sources to explain and interpret colonial Latin American history and the conquest. And then finally, you see, again, Matthew Restall, a book called Maya Conquistador, again, looking at Mayan roles in what has traditionally been seen as a Spanish conquest. So again, hopefully this is giving you a sense of this. And so I just want to sort of conclude this section of the lecture by then talking about the new conclusions that were drawn by colonial Latin American historians because of this new kind of focus and these new sources that are brought in, or at least not that they're new sources, but they're bringing them in, whereas previous historians had not. It leads to new conclusions. And actually, I'm going to go back to a previous slide just to show you again, since I just spent so much time talking about these books. We are now at this final part of the revisionist history. We looked at the 1960s, the new topics, the new sources, the new questions asked of the new sources, the works that are including all of this, and then the new conclusions that they came up with. So this is where I'm now picking up here is what are the new conclusions of the revisionist history. So I'm going to go back through these slides real quick. So one new conclusion is that they come up with, or I should say within the new conclusions, they come up with a new periodization with regard to conquest that really destabilizes and negates or sort of rejects the displacement model. And what I mean by new periodization, or periodization in history, is just how historians divide up history into different periods. So for the colonial Latin Americanists, rather than the conquest being sort of the one watershed event, that there's sort of this before and after. Before the conquest, there's no colony. After the conquest, now we have a Spanish colony. What they said is no, it actually happens gradually, and they divide the colonial period into three different eras. So there's a new periodization brought to the history of colonial Latin America. And what they do is they divide it into sort of three phases or three eras. The first phase goes between, say, 1520 and 1570, that there's actually relatively little change in the colonial societies. if you live outside of Cuzco and Tenochtitlan, that from that sort of first 50 years, that first generation after the conquest of Tenochtitlan and Cuzco, for people who lived outside of those cities, there was relatively little change in their life. So if you lived in, say, an IU or a village, out, say, an IU in the Andes, say, you know, far north of Cuzco, you're going to continue to live in your IU. You're going to continue to practice your vertical agriculture. You're going to continue to have to give labor and some tribute. You're going to have to contribute to the storehouses. You're going to have to work for the authorities in that mita labor arrangement. But instead of working for the Inca and sending, the food for the storehouses for the Inca army, now it's going to be for Spaniards. So that the Spaniards basically have kind of replaced the main leadership of the Aztec and Inca empires, but they really continue to rely on the tribute systems, the the governing structures in place in order to rule these areas. So they basically just replaced the Inca and Aztec leadership, but those the way the society, the economy, the political system is functioning is still largely on top of the former structures of the Aztec and Inca Empire. And in that way, then, for the most part, for the common people, the common Native Americans living in these areas, they're not, their life doesn't change that much. Then from 1570 to 1620, this is known as a sort of a period of transition where you do start to see some real disruptions in terms of the economy, some real disruptions in terms of political structures, and that and in terms of land owning patterns as well, and agricultural production patterns. Those things really start to change, and we start to see some real environmental changes as well that pave the way for Spanish rule to get more and more entrenched in the society, and that disrupt the old, Aztec and Inca structures. These start to get disrupted and displaced in a way that then allows for a Spanish colonial regime to really start to dig in and have some stability and some maturity. And we will be looking at this period of transition after the midterm and talking about how and why it allows for Spanish colonization to become more entrenched and really destabilizes the former kind of Aztec and Inca structures. And so then, as you can imagine, then a third era or third period in this goes from 1620 to 1700, where you see a growing integration of the colonial system. You start to see a mature colonial system developing, and this is where I think you could argue that now you have a colonial system in place with a fully developed bureaucracy, and where now people's lives, even if you're living in an IU, far north of Cusco, your life now has been impacted by Spanish rule. And again, and if you're living, say you live, outside of Tenochtitlan, you are going to also have been impacted by colonial rule in some way, so that it's really starts to kind of filter into, you know, indigenous societies, indigenous practices, and also colonial rule is filtering out from just those capital cities or just the Spanish urban centers of the colonies. Now, more and more people are going to start to be affected by this. And so this is really the major conclusions that are drawn in the revisionist narrative. And now you can see here this displacement model has largely been questioned and rejected. There isn't an immediate displacement for most people. It takes a good century following the conquest for that Spanish colonial regime to really get thoroughly entrenched within these societies. And to explain how and why this happens, then we're going to see some examples of this, but in order to explain how and why it happens, I want to explain and define some key terms that can help to shed light on how and why the process took place and how and why it takes place in the way that it does. So again, these sort of revisionist conclusions then can show us then that this displacement model doesn't work, that colonialism is a really complex process, that it doesn't happen monolithically or absolutely, that it takes place in steps. And in this way, it also leads to, on the one hand, it leads to, but also requires new ideas toward and attitudes about power and domination and how that takes place within a society. And so now we're going to come back to Gramsci, who I talked about initially, and social theory. And I also want to introduce to you several terms that are necessary in order to understand these processes and in order to understand sort of the full implications of this revised interpretation of colonization happening in steps. So I want to go through these definitions and then we'll kind of bring it back into colonial Latin America. And actually see these things kind of in play, in place and taking place in colonial Latin America in terms of its history as well. So the first definition I want to talk about is a term called syncretism. So syncretism basically means blending. It's the idea that when two cultures come together, it isn't that one culture completely prevails over and dominates the other culture, but instead you start to see, even in exploitative relationships, you do see a blending of cultural characteristics. It's not that one just completely displaces the other. So again, this is questioning that displacement model. And when this happens, then they blend together in order to create something new, to the extent that eventually you can't necessarily say, okay, this is from one of the cultures and this is from the other, but instead they start to be so amalgamated that they create something new. Now, we will be looking at examples of syncretism here, and I will be pointing out sort of the Spanish kind of characteristics and then the indigenous characteristics. So I will be doing some of that to be able to see the different elements that get blended together. But just remember that it's sort of creating something new. And we're going to look at this with regard to art and architecture and religion in colonial Latin America. It becomes the artistic styles, the architectural styles, and the religious practices, as I had alluded to earlier, of Catholicism are the result of a blending of different traditions. So that's syncretism. And if you have syncretism, when two cultures come together and their characteristics become blended into a syncretic tradition, that means that neither of the cultures that have come into contact are completely powerless or completely passive, that they each are demonstrating an influence on the other. And if a culture then is able to have that influence, then it isn't completely passive and it does have some power to act. And this is what agency is the power to act, and in some way be able to kind of control in some ways, sometimes, more rather than less, sometimes less rather than more, but your ability to control to some extent your own destiny, to be able to make choices, even if those choices are limited in a very exploitative system. And what this means is that everybody has agency of some sort. Everybody has the ability to act in some way, the ability to make choices and make decisions, even in the most exploitative of situations. So, for instance, I think in the instance of slavery, you might think that the slave owner has all the power and the slave has no power, and there's no question that this is a terribly exploitative institution in which a slave's ability to act is going to be severely hampered. But at the same time, this doesn't mean that the slave has no agency and is completely passive in the face of that exploitation. Slaves could and did make choices in terms of they could resist the slave owner, they could run away, they could rebel. But you can also see instances of sort of more what may be referred to as passive resistance, breaking tools, working as slowly as possible, and being as unproductive as possible, sort of within a certain range. And then and so in those ways are those that sort of examples of resistance, but also showing examples of resilience as well, and sort of coping strategies in terms of the cultural practices of beautiful songwriting and singing, of religious worship. There are ways that slaves could work to mitigate their circumstances, in some ways to be able to cope with it, but also to be able to resist it. And you see this among indigenous people as well in the Americas, again in exploitative relationships, say with the encomienda. Even if you are in a highly unequal relationship, it doesn't mean that you don't have the power to act. And finally, another sort of related term is that of hegemony. And in particular, we're talking about cultural hegemony here. But hegemony, at its most basic in its most basic definition, in its most basic, oh, sorry, I'll get to there in a second. Actually, let me go past this for a second. So hegemony at its most basic understanding is domination. It means to have hegemony over someone is to be dominating them. So, in the situations I've been talking about, say, having agency, even in a hegemonic situation where there's one group dominating over another, both groups still have the power to act and to have agency, have decision making power, to different degrees, but they would both have that. But in this case, we're looking at issues of domination and force. But for cultural hegemony, then that is domination that's not by force alone. And as I said, this was developed by this concept of cultural hegemony was developed by a man named Antonio Gramsci, who was, as I said, a sort of a Marxist scholar. And Gramsci posed the question as to why it is that people accept domination and oppression, why unfair systems can be perpetuated, even when it's clear that there are aspects of these systems that rewards some and that are very, very unfair and exploitative to others. Why do societies accept this? Why do societies not, overthrow these unequal, sort of unfair systems? And what he argued is for a concept of cultural hegemony, in which people who are dominated within a system actually in some ways work to perpetuate that system unwittingly and in some ways very unconsciously. And this happens when the dominant culture is able to impose its values and practices on dominant people. And eventually those practices become accepted as sort of normal and natural and become the people within the system actually internalize these values and then practice them and perpetuate them, and then in that way ultimately end up being part of a system and perpetuating a system that actually oppresses them. And it allows, again, what this does is it helps to explain why unfair dominant systems are able to stay in place not through the threat of force alone. So the concept of hegemony argues that domination takes place not through force alone, but also through cultural means. And the way that this is done, as I said, is that the dominant culture is able to impose certain cultural values and certain kinds of practices that people at all levels of the system eventually will buy into. And that through this, then, these values and practices get internalized and perpetuated to the point where they become normal and natural. They become considered sort of normal and natural, and unquestioned within a society. But overall, those who are who are carrying out these practices and implementing these values through actions, end up perpetuating a system that is repressive, and can actually end up even participating and reproducing a system that ultimately oppresses the same people that are participating in it. And this helps to explain then why people will accept unequal power within a society, but not because they're passive and don't have the ability to act, but because they are making choices. And in some ways, the choices that they're making and the actions they're taking may, I mean, they take these actions and they make these choices because it does help them in the short term. It does help them in the immediate term, but ultimately may end up, as I said, perpetuating a system that oppresses them. So I'll go through some examples of them. This can be sort of a difficult concept to understand in the abstract, but once you see it in place, then you can see how and why it might make sense. So an example of this might be, I think, in the modern day, I'll often bring this up in classes, is why do we in our society, our modern day society, accept that there are people who live in multi-million-dollar mansions, and then that there are people who have to live on the street, people who are homeless and don't have access even to the most basic resources, food, shelter, medical care. Yet you then have people who live in these multi-million-dollar mansions and have every possible sort of financial advantage. Why do we accept this as a society? Why are we not out in the street protesting this every single day, until it is remedied and corrected? Again, why are there people with so much excessive wealth and then people with nothing? And what I would argue is that there is a certain sort of what's the word, narrative that's put forth in our society of that anybody can raise themselves up from their bootstraps. So if you don't, so the people who have a lot, they've earned that and they have a right to it. And the people who haven't, well, that's because of their that's sort of their own fault. It's not the society that is to blame. It's not the system that is to blame. And while we're arguing that people have choices within a society, there are certain sort of structures that are put into place, and opportunities and rights that certain people have and certain people don't, and that's what is sort of perpetuating this system. And this gets into arguments about structural racism, systemic racism, that have been discussed, and it also plays into ideas of hegemony, because what you'll find also is that people in say in modern U.S. society have absorbed certain values, and certain ideas about what's fair and what's not fair, and also have sort of absorbed ideas about what is what's appropriate, what can show high status, and one example of this I'll often talk about too is when somebody buys a car. I don't know if you've ever known somebody who's bought a car that they can't really afford, or people who use, people who have used, credit cards to buy things that they can't really afford. Why do people do this? Because in the end, who does this ultimately benefit? It benefits you know, the car companies and the CEOs, the really, really rich, CEOs of these car companies, or it benefits the CEOs, ultimately the CEOs of the big banks, say in the instance of a credit card. And you end up paying, huge amounts of interest, say on a credit card, or you're paying off this car over a long time. You can't really afford it. In the end, who does it ultimately benefit? It's going to ultimately benefit the rich, the wealthy elite. It does might benefit you in the short term because you got to buy something you really wanted, and you might really love that car, and you might the car might increase your status among, say, your peer group, but in the end, it ultimately hurts you, financially. And so this is an example of hegemony, and you might not have even thought about it or realized it because it seems quite normal and natural, to buy, to finance a car or to use credit cards. Credit card use is so, prevalent, in our society, that this is sort of an example of a modern day hegemony where, we end up participating in a system that will ultimately sort of oppress us, and then but reward, the elites. So, so that's sort of hegemony kind of in the modern day, and I want to give some examples of hegemony, in colonial Latin American society. But before I do that, I just want to conclude, actually, oh sorry, with one more, sort of element before I go into these different examples. Actually, I want to conclude by saying, two more things. I want to recap sort of the definition then of hegemony, in as it was laid out in the article by Susan Kellogg that we read about, hegemony out of conquest. And there she gives, examples of hegemony and how it worked as well. And I will echo, some of those examples here in the lecture. And then I want to also say, what does this all mean? What do these, when you take these definitions all together, what do they mean for colonial Latin America? So, what Kellogg argues then, or what she puts forth as the definition for hegemony, is that she says, by hegemony, I refer not to domination based ultimately on physical force or its threat, but to more consensual or voluntary forms of control. Hegemony develops not because people have agreed to their own subjugation, but because the dominating power has been able to institute or substitute practices and beliefs which eventually appear normal and natural. So, and it says, but hegemony is not simply imposed. It's a product of complex processes of conflict, negotiation, dialogue, and accommodation, even in colonial situations. So she's saying, it's not like we want to be dominated. It's not that people who are exploited are saying, yes, absolutely, I want to participate in this. It's that, practices and beliefs are instituted and become sort of normalized in a way that people adhere to them without even realizing that they are perpetuating this kind of system. So I wanted to make that point, and then also then, say that, by learning these terms, syncretism, agency, and hegemony, you can see that they're all related to, the issue of power and who has power and domination in society, and how ultimately unequal systems of domination are able to be imposed and able to be perpetuated. And so, in this sense, it complicates the ideas about how we see power in society. The power doesn't just come from brute force, but also through cultural means and cultural values. So you can see then this is how Gramsci was sort of challenging Marx by bringing culture into the issues of domination and class struggle. But it also gives agency to the conquered. So in this way, you're not just seeing power as, in a dichotomous way, sort of as all or nothing, the haves and the have-nots. Everybody has power in society, to differing degrees. Everybody has agency. It's not that you have one active group and one passive group, but everyone's participating, everyone has agency. So again, this is questioning that displacement model as well. That, it isn't that just the Spaniards had all the power and did all of the action. Indigenous people are participating as well. You see in that book, Indian conquistadors, they were making choices to ally with Cortez. They were making choices to go to, lay siege to Tenochtitlan and help him, work with the Spaniards to build these collapsible boats, and to defeat the Aztecs. They were making choices as well. Even though this ends up putting in place a system of domination that will eventually oppress the Tlaxcalans, as well. So, in that sense, then, these ideas about power then will recognize Indigenous people as actors, who were able then to respond in different ways to the colonial system. They were able to then make some choices, like we saw with Marlene Seen. They're able to make some choices along the way that may help them to shape their own destinies, even while they're helping to put in place a system that's ultimately going to dominate them as well. And they're also able to pick and choose what works for them and reject what doesn't. And sometimes that meant accepting actually parts of Spanish colonization and the Spanish culture. And in some ways, it also sometimes meant rejection of certain aspects of it as well. So that when you're faced with conquest and domination, you don't just have one choice that you can either accept it or reject it. There's actually a whole range of choices and ways that you can act. You can choose to acculturate or assimilate. You can absorb certain aspects of the dominant culture. You can resist that dominant culture. You can outright rebel, or you can have sort of passive resistance that I had referred to earlier. You can sort of pretend to go along with the system, but then in your actions in your daily life, you can resist in various ways. You can you can negotiate with the dominant culture, or with the dominant elites. You can confer with them. You can try to reach some sort of compromise or agreement. And what Kellogg argues is that the Spaniards could not just come in and establish this displacement model system. They had to work with indigenous people. They had to negotiate. So Spaniards have to do it. Indigenous people do this as well. And you can manipulate the system as well. Like I said, you can sort of pretend to go along with certain things while working to detract from that system, say in secret or in ways that the dominant culture may not notice or realize. So there's lots of different ways that you can respond to a dominant culture. And the way we can do this, the way we can understand this then, is through the idea of agency. Everybody's participating in this system. Through syncretism, it isn't just a displacement model. There's a blending of cultures that takes place. And then how this works through hegemony, a domination that is not by force alone, or the threat of force, but through cultural means. So let's look at some examples of that. I'm going to talk about an economic example, and then some artistic examples, and some religious, some economic examples, some legal responses, artistic and architectural responses, as well as religious responses. So turning to an example of an economic response to conquest that shows this idea of hegemony, comes through the example that related to a little insect called the cochineal. And you might be wondering, what on earth would this insect have to do with hegemony and Spanish domination? But I will explain. So with the arrival of the Spanish, they bring with them a number of new kind of economic opportunities that we will look at in that colonial transition period after the midterm. For instance, they bring in livestock, sheep, cattle, and horses that the Americas had not had, and you start to see ranching industries, sheep herding industries, textile industries where the wool is woven into cloth. Mining industries. And what this does is it leads to new opportunities for profit, new economic opportunities, not only for Spaniards, but for indigenous people as well. And this can also then lead to new opportunities for social differentiation and for the consumption of luxury goods among people who were making a lot of money. And this can serve then to break down traditional indigenous structures as well. And one example of this happens with the cochineal. So the cochineal is a bug. It's a little insect that actually is colonized on the maguey cactus. You may have seen examples of this, in Southern California. These cacti are everywhere, and you'll often see them with these little white colonies, these little white colonies of bugs. That's the cochineal bug, that basically they're sort of parasitic. They live off of the maguey cactus. And if you take the female cochineal and you kill them, basically dry them, and then grind them up. They produce this absolutely beautiful red dye. It's sort of various shades of red. This is you can see here a picture of cochineal dye. It's the red, the little red bowl that's underneath. The one above it is actually indigo, and so you can see cochineal produces beautiful red pigment that was very much in demand among by Europeans who wanted to use it to dye cloth and to make red paint, and it quickly becomes very, very popular in Europe and is in great demand. And so now you've got basically a huge kind of global export market for cochineal. And you could, if you could grow, I'm sorry, if you could grow maguey cactus and then harvest cochineal and then sell it, you could make a lot of money. And so a lot of indigenous people actually started to grow cochineal, and instead of actually growing staple crops, the corn, um, the and the beans and the squash, that was the traditional and quite nutritious Mexican diet. Now their fields are full of of maguey cactus, which in itself did have some nutritional value as well, but you can't just live on maguey, and so they would only grow maguey cactus in order to harvest the cochineal. And what happens then is you start to see not only a problem with having subsistence agriculture, but these people who are able to sell the cochineal start to get rich. And when they are getting rich, they're able to buy things that they wouldn't have been able to buy before. They're able to have certain practices and maybe have a really luxurious lifestyle that they couldn't have afforded before. And and that wouldn't have even been possible living, say, in a traditional IU or in a traditional the Aztec sort of social structure of the Calpuli. You wouldn't have had this kind of opportunity before, and now you do, and this is then going to really upset kind of traditional ways of living, traditional hierarchies within indigenous societies. And you can actually see this in a letter to there's a letter that was written by the Tlaxcalan Cabildo to the King of Spain. This is from the 1560s. I actually have a quote from it. And this was an indigenous cabildo, town council, complaining about how many people are growing cochineal and what it's doing to their communities. So it says, this is from the letter from the cabildo to the King of Spain. It says, we have deliberated about how the cochineal cactus, from which cochineal comes, is being planted all over Tlaxcala. Everyone does nothing but take care of cochineal cactus. No longer is care taken that maize and other edibles are planted. No one wants to cultivate their fields anymore, but idly neglects them. Because of this, now fields are going to grass, and famine truly impends. Things are no longer as they were long ago, for the cochineal cactus is making people lazy. And no longer do they go to church to hear Mass, but look only to getting their sustenance and cacao, that's the chocolate, which makes them proud. And then later they buy pulque, which is this fermented beverage that comes from the maguey syrup. So they buy pulque and then get drunk. So here you can see lots of things going on. This is the Tlaxcalan Cabildo. So this is basically the Tlaxcalan elites are saying, hey, now people are growing all this, they're harvesting all this cochineal. They're not planting their fields with edible foods. So famine is impending, but they're also getting really lazy. They're drinking chocolate, which was traditionally reserved only for the elites. So they're disrupting all of these processes. But you can also see something else in this quote, and I'm not sure if you noticed it, but the Cabildo is complaining that people aren't going to Mass. So there you can see actually an assimilation has already taken place among the Tlaxcalan elites who want their people to be going to Mass. So you can see there's some assimilation of Catholicism as well. So lots of things going on in that letter, but you can see this is an example of then an economic a way that hegemony is taking place in terms of economic practices. Nobody's forcing these people to grow only cochineal. but it's the introduction of a new market economy has led to this. And this also means that you can't now go back and reject Spanish rule. So look at the Cabildo is writing to the crown to complain about this. So this means they're accepting the crown's authority. Um, this also means that indigenous people who are growing and selling the cochineal, harvesting and selling the cochineal, are also buying into a Spanish economic system, and it's becoming more and more difficult. It's going to become difficult to impossible to throw off Spanish rule. So ultimately, is this good for indigenous people? I mean, you could say yes, because now they've got economic opportunities they didn't have before, and they've got wealth they didn't have before. But it's also breaking down indigenous social structures that would have held them together. And it's basically allowing the Spanish system to have the authority to continue to rule over them as well. That's ultimately going to lead to a larger exploitation of all indigenous people within the system, or at least a vast majority. And actually, before I go into this mural, I want to go through an example of sort of legal behavior that leads to hegemony that Kellogg actually talks about in her article, which is that once the Spanish system is put in place and the audiencia system that we had talked about, they're basically Spanish court systems that are put in place. So the audiencia is one of them. They also put in place a series of local courts, sort of Indian courts, where indigenous people could go and carry through lawsuits. And when this happens, indigenous communities actually, as soon as this court system is put in place, indigenous communities really start to take each other to court quite actively and vigorously, because there had been the sort of old scores that they'd wanted to settle, sort of land disputes, various kinds of disputes that had been in place for a long time, but for which there had not been, a system in which they could get these disputes settled, and that they really sort of take advantage of the Spanish court systems in order to basically sue each other. And so on the one hand, you could say, well, this is good for people who were able to, protect their lands from the encroachment of, say, other indigenous communities. And I will say also they would sue Spaniards, any Spaniards who tried to come in and encroach on indigenous community lands. They would take them to the court, and oftentimes they would win. So you could say, hey, this is kind of good for them. They're able to have legal protections. But think about how this could play into the Spanish being able to dominate this system, and how hegemony could be at play here, because by using the Spanish court systems and then accepting the Spanish judge rulings, you're accepting Spanish authority. And again, it's going to become more and more difficult and quickly become impossible to throw off the system or to resist it in any way that would be effective among a large sector of the population. You're basically accepting the power. And you could see that again with that Tlaxcala and Cabildo letter, where they're writing to the king to complain. They want the king to do something about it. So they're recognizing the king's authorities. And so in that way, they're getting integrated into the system. They're accepting the Spanish authority, and they're accepting the use of court systems and the production of, say, cochineal for a market economy as normal and natural. They're accepting these values and these practices and then perpetuating them. So hopefully now you can start to see how hegemony is starting to work in practice. I think it starts to make more sense when you can see these examples. And then I want to go into some artistic responses as well through art and architecture. And this really brings in the concept of syncretism, because what we're really going to see in a series of images that I want to show you now are indigenous elements in art and artwork and architecture, and then European elements and how those are getting blended. And again, this shows agency on the part of Spaniards as well as indigenous people, and particularly among indigenous artists and artisans. So I just want to show you here, this is a church mural that was painted by an indigenous person, an anonymous indigenous person in the 16th century. So not only do we have an indigenous person painting a mural on a church, which again can show you some aspect of hegemony, they are participating in say the building and decoration of churches, which we will see also in other slides. But you can also see here there a vision of the Spanish, because, and this is, I find this sort of an interesting picture. This is actually a picture of a horse that has basically a head attached, and then if you look, the horse is wearing sandals. So let me just get I'll show this to you. So here is, sorry, where is my cursor? So here is the body of the horse, and then you'll see it has a head, and then it's wearing sandals. It has shoes on, and this is because it's said that when the say the Nahuas or the Mayans and the Nahuas first saw the Spaniards riding horses, they at first thought it might be like a kind of like a centaur, like a person, an animal that's part human and part animal, so that it was the horse and the rider were one, and you can kind of see this here. It's sort of an interesting example of kind of the blending of indigenous ideas, but depicting a Spaniard and his horse, and that this is painted on a church. You can see that kind of blending of indigenous and Spanish. Here's a portrait of Jesus, again made by an indigenous artist using eagle feathers. So Aztecs, Nahua peoples used eagle feathers for decoration and the decorative arts quite frequently. So here you can see then a Nahua decorative style, but to depict Jesus. So basically to depict a very, very strongly Christian theme here. So this is another example of syncretism. You can see that in church architecture throughout Latin America as well. So here's some European church architecture in Gothic, mainly Gothic cathedrals, but just sort of get a visual of this. They're largely made out of stone, very imposing, not very colorful. And then here's some cathedrals in Latin America. Again, these are sort of in the central areas of Cuzco and of Mexico City. So these, I think, in some ways are quite similar to the European. They're not very colorful. They're largely constructed out of stone. They're very imposing, these huge imposing structures. Kind of bulky as well. Now compare that to what you see among Mexican, churches in Mexico and Peru. Here's an example of a church that is in Zacatecas in Mexico. It's a really important silver mining town, which we will again look at after the midterm. And here you can see that it is largely made of stone, not very colorful, but the front of it is highly decorative, and this is in what we call a Baroque style that again we'll look at. We'll talk about that a bit more after the midterm, but it's a highly decorative style. But these cathedrals were largely constructed and decorated by indigenous artisans, and what we'll see is that within all that elaborate decoration, a lot of indigenous themes where they would depict, say, little sort of mythical animals, or they would, this was quite typical of sort of Nahua art, was to have kind of intertwining vines and leaves and flowers. That was a sort of a typical of indigenous decoration, and you see that then incorporated into the European kind of Baroque style in these cathedrals. So again, you can see the syncretism and the blending of indigenous and European styles. And you see this in Puebla. The city of Puebla in Mexico is known for its ceramics, for making beautiful ceramics. Again, as I had talked about earlier, that's largely adopted from its Islamic heritage, and you can see it here implemented in what's known as the Poblano style, of Puebla. It's an architectural style of intertwining sort of bricks and then this tile work. And again, sort of bricks made from local materials, but then also juxtaposed or put next to this tile work. So it's again sort of this blending of the Spanish and indigenous styles to create something new, to create a new kind of poblano architectural style. And now we can look at the cathedral, I'm sorry, the church architecture as well. So this is a church from Puebla where you can see that poblano style of the alternating brick and tile work. But also look how decorative this is. So you can say that that's some of the Baroque kind of decorative style, very, very highly kind of almost gaudily decorated. But you're also starting to see some real color here. And if you were to look up close, you would be able to see sort of the intertwining vines and fruits and animals and things like that of the indigenous artisans. You can see that here. This is the Church of Tonancintla, which is, you can really see the colorful styles here, which is evidence of indigenous artistic styles. And when they would depict saints, actually, let me go back. I'll show you this in a second. When they would depict saints, the saints often had darker skin and would resemble indigenous people, have more indigenous features as well. So I'll show you some of that. But here's this is a close-up of some plaster work, decorative plaster work inside of a church in Oaxaca. That here you can see those intertwining vines. You can see the depiction of the saints with sort of more olive skin tones that would have resembled more indigenous people. So these indigenous artisans are making saints in their own image. And again, these are examples of syncretism. And here's some of this incredibly decorative plasterwork at this church of Tonancintla. And then here is again a close-up of a saint who's depicted on in that very, very colorful church that I had shown you. So you can see basically a Mexican style is developing that's a syncretic style that blends elements of European art and architecture with indigenous art and architecture. And just to compare, again, here's the church face at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris with the different saints depicted, and compare that very stone, the stone kind of three-dimensional, sort of highly the images here of the people are very, very high, of the saints are highly intricate. And if you just compare that with this, you can see this is different. It looks quite different. It's so much more colorful, and it's bringing in those indigenous elements as well. So this is creating something new and unique through this syncretic style. And again, you can see that here too. You compare that. So now I want to turn to, so that's some of the art and architecture where you can see that syncretic style, and we're also going to see a syncretic style when it comes to religion as well. So last week we looked at the spiritual conquest. I've questioned that whole interpretation of a displacement model of spiritual conquest earlier in this lecture. And what I would say now is that when the friars come in and try to convert native peoples, and they are quite successful, as we saw in baptizing people, or at least nominally bringing people into Christianity and Catholicism. When you scratch the surface, you find that there is still a lot of indigenous elements and influence within the kind of Catholicism that develops. And if you think about some of the Franciscan practices would have encouraged this. They actively tried to make ties to indigenous worship practices, worshiping outside, placing, building cathedrals and chapels in places where Aztecs had traditionally gone to worship different gods. They actively tried to do this, and they actively emphasized commonalities in belief as well that may not have been an exact fit but they were okay with it. It's okay. It's close enough, and at least we'll get them to understand it, enough to get them baptized so that we can save them before the end of the world comes. As we saw, that leads to some problems and issues, but it also leads to a syncretic. It opens the door to syncretic religious practices and religious syncretism in the kind of Catholicism that develops in Mexico and Peru and throughout basically colonial Latin America. That's really a blending of indigenous and European traditions. And one example of this is in the Day of the Dead, which is basically a Mexican holiday or sort of set of holidays. It's all that comes out of a Catholic tradition of the celebration of All Saints Day and All Souls Day. Actually, All Souls Day comes first, and that is the night before All Souls Day is actually Halloween. Um, then you practice All Souls Day, and then, or sorry, All Saints. So one example of syncretism in Mexican society, Mexican Catholicism, comes from the celebration of the Day of the Dead. Um, the Day of the Dead is no, takes place on November 2nd, and it comes from, well, it takes place on November 2nd, and it's a holiday in which Mexican families will go and oftentimes go to the cemetery to visit the graves of deceased relatives, and then in their homes or in the cemeteries will actually create altars for the deceased person, to remember them, and to they'll oftentimes like make their favorite foods and things like that. And the idea is that the spirit of the relative is there, and you can it's sort of a way of honoring them and also being able to sort of visit them. And it comes from uh, both a European and sort of a Mexican tradition. On the European side of things, it originates from the Catholic holidays of All Souls Day and All Saints Day, which are celebrated on November 1st and November 2nd. And then the eve of those celebrations then is October 31st, which is then Halloween. So Halloween is sort of related into this as well. Um, and again, so the syncretism then comes because this is sort of based out of or sort of affiliated with the All Souls and All Saints days, these Roman Catholic traditions, but it combines with sort of um, you know a more sort of a Nawa view or more of an indigenous view of death, and which death and life are considered sort of two sides of existence. There's a much more of an acceptance of death, say within, I think, Mexican society. In my mind, I think it's a much healthier attitude toward death in the sense that the dead are considered to still be kind of among the living, and you can sort of commune with them and visit with them. And there's almost a sort of a playful attitude toward death in some ways. Instead of it being sort of shut off and sort of divorced from everyday society, it is sort of blended in with them, and sort of brought in to everyday existence. And so you can see then sort of the European Roman Catholic tradition blended with indigenous ideas and practices regarding death and its place in society. And so you can see that here there are Day of the Dead dolls that are, where you've got skulls, you've got skulls that are made of sugar, sort of candy skulls, chocolate skulls. Um, and here's a Day of the Dead altar. Where you'll have some of that, as I said, some of the deceased sort of favorite foods. It's a time for the family to come together and sort of remember this person as well. Here's another Day of the Dead altar. And then here's a calendar of death days. Instead of birthdays, you've got death anniversaries. Again, so that people can remember and you don't have to just, um, you know, pretend that this doesn't happen or have it divorced from your society and your everyday life. You can remember and celebrate these people through their death anniversaries as well. And then one final example I just want to give of syncretism in sort of the kind of Catholicism that develops in Spanish America is another example from Mexico is the Virgin of Guadalupe. So the Virgin of Guadalupe is considered to be sort of one embodiment of the Virgin Mary who appeared originally in a city in Spain called Guadalupe, and then she would be worshipped sort of by local people where she made her miraculous appearance. And so there's a tradition of worshiping different appearances of Mary in different places, and so this is one example. And then the worship of the Virgin of Guadalupe then is brought to Mexico by Spaniards, but it is early. Well, but it's said to have been adopted by indigenous people as well. And there's sort of a legend behind the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico that it's said that she actually made another miraculous appearance to an indigenous man named Juan Diego in the 1520s or 1530s. So very early on in the colonial period, she makes an appearance to an indigenous man. And it's said that he goes and tells the bishop about this appearance, and the bishop doesn't believe him. So he goes back to the spot. It's sort of a long story attached to it, but there are other miracles that are sort of involved. And at one point, the Virgin appears to him, and she has this cloak, and on the cloak are these flowers, and then the flowers become real, and then they fall down in front of Juan Diego, and then he picks up these flowers, which were roses, that he goes and shows the archbishop again to prove that she's appeared to him, and it's considered miraculous. Everyone knows this must have been a miracle because those roses didn't grow at that time of year, and that kind of thing. And then this story is written down in the 1650s and becomes very, very popular. And from then on, the worship of this Virgin of Guadalupe as a patron saint becomes more and more intense, and she becomes very, very popular to the point where she becomes a patron saint of Mexico. And I think if you have any familiarity with Mexican culture, you will not have missed her appearance, her presence in Mexican culture. And I would say in Southern California, Arizona, and New Mexico, you'll see altars to the Virgin of Guadalupe. You'll see candles for the Virgin of Guadalupe in the grocery stores. I mean, um, she's quite prominent in the United States as well. If you go to Mexico, you'll see little shrines to the Virgin of Guadalupe in parking garages and grocery stores. Lots of people will have them in their homes as well. So she's extremely popular, and she is considered to be another sort of example of syncretism in the sense that she's a Catholic, a Christian, a Catholic saint. And it's an appearance of the Virgin Mary. So her attachment to and being part of the Catholic tradition is very, very clear. But she's considered to be a dark-skinned virgin. If you look at this image of her, she was painted to resemble indigenous people. She was said to resemble indigenous people. She is supposed to be a saint who is to protect all people, but particularly bring in indigenous people. And she is also considered by Mexicans to have appeared specifically in Mexico. This particular apparition of her appears in Mexico to an indigenous man, and where she appeared was associated in Mexico City with what had been a shrine to an Aztec mother goddess referred to as Tonantzin, Tonantzi, Zin. So that's Tonantzin, who was sort of an Aztec mother goddess. She happens to appear in the same place where there had been a shrine to Tonantzin, where Nahua peoples had gone to worship Tonantzin. This is where the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared. And so people also believe that this was her message. The message was to indigenous people that I am, I'm your mother goddess here. I'm your mother. I'm the Virgin Mary. I am going to appear to you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to lead you. And I should say, she wouldn't have been seen sort of as a goddess. This is not a polytheistic religion. Christianity is not, but she would have had a very, very important role as a saint and as a representative of the Virgin Mary. And so the message is, I am a saint for the indigenous people. I will be protective of you as well as all the Mexican people. And that she appeared to the Mexican people especially, and that this was this is part of the message as well. And so in that sense, the Virgin of Guadalupe is considered, as I said, a really important symbol of religious syncretism and as a way of bringing indigenous people into Catholic worship as well. So there you see the hegemony, people being brought into a system that's going to dominate them, but making the choice to do so because it may be appealing to them in various ways as well. So those are the examples that I wanted to give of sort of the indigenous responses to conquest. Showing examples of indigenous agency as well as examples of syncretism, and then how these play into this hegemonic system that gets imposed.